To start out, I think it was maybe like 4 or 5 phantom. From there, it was kind of right away. To be said, this was also during COVID. So, everything was kind of layering up. It's like, all right, well, what's the easiest kind of solution?
Those are a lot of challenges. I mean, I think turnover, pretty common for people. What would you do differently, Kyle?
Knowing what I know now, we could sit here and say, oh, I would track it at the granular level.
This is Trial and Error, where we dive deep into the world of clinical trials, uncovering the challenges, breakthroughs, and stories behind the scenes. I'm your host, Ellis, and in this episode, we'll be talking about a fatty liver study using imaging for both safety objectives and exploratory endpoints. This global study involved DEXA scan phantom cross-calibration, requiring each site with the DEXA machine to have a phantom scan completed at least once. Today, my guest is Kyle Martinez. Kyle is a seasoned clinical research professional, currently serving as the principal clinical team lead at a mid-sized CRO. With a career spanning over 15 years in the field, Kyle's career started off working on the clinical research site side like many others. From there, he's worked with several big-name CROs, starting off as a CRA and now leading teams in his current position. With his experience in diverse range of therapeutic areas and work as a global lead on multiple trials, he strives to ensure the delivery of high-quality data and the improvement of patient outcomes in clinical research. In this episode, we cover how certain small communication missteps can cause big study headaches downstream. In particular, we discuss the challenges of coordinating calibration equipment across sites, how manual trackers can mislead study teams, and what to do when you find yourself operating against the clock, like many of us. The details in this study have been anonymized to protect the identities of individuals and stakeholders involved while maintaining the spirit and learnings of the study. And with that, I bring you Kyle Martinez.
Okay, well, Kyle, thank you so much for being here as always, and welcome to the podcast. Super excited for this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it and happy to be here as well.
Before we get started, I've asked this question to a lot of people, and I don't think I've really ever heard a consistent response here, but how did you get into clinical research? And before you answer that, I don't know if you've ever seen Dance Fair as Me, but it's like, how did you get into clinical research? And is someone like falling off a stairwell and they're just like, like that? That's kind of sometimes how I feel about that response, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just landed into it. Yeah, I think that's always interesting is getting everyone's take of how they land into research or, people who have come into it. But yeah, myself, I was a participant in some research studies when I was in college. I did participate in some research studies, and I also took some ethics classes later in college. So that kind of gave me the intro to understanding what research was about. And from there, after graduation from college, having that little bit of understanding, I was able to land a research coordinator position in my town where I lived. So that kind of got me started there. But yeah, it was a little bit of, the little understanding. I was, had thoughts about going to graduate school after school. So it's kind of like a leap year type thing. So I'll get into research and then kind of getting that full understanding, realizing the career path and all that was involved. That's what kind of got me started and kind of kept me in from there.
Amazing. The classic college participant to clinical research fund. No,
Yes.
It's funny. I was actually in a couple of college studies, not pharmaceutical, not for any pharmaceutical, but like just the kind of PI driven ones. But it never occurred to me. I was like, oh, this could be a possible career path for myself. Yeah, let's dive in. You had mentioned that you had a liver study that you'd worked on where there were quite a few challenges with scans, I guess, leading to a race against the clock towards the end of the study. I think the racing against the clock towards the end of the study is something I hear often, but the phantom scans is I'm not super familiar with it. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Yeah, no, I think everyone has that uphill battle, race against the clock. For the instance we're going to talk about is, in relation to our database locks. So, I think everyone can kind of sympathize or more or less the begrudging, to getting to and, meeting those milestones. But yeah, so this was a liver study that we held, we had imaging component to it. So we had, for safety perspective, we had used DEXAs, bone scans for bone density scans. That was to confirm and to rule out that investigational product did not lead to any bone density issues. We also had an MRI and MRE component. So that was MRE component, probably a lot maybe have not heard of, is that's elastography, and that had to do directly with like the liver. So that was more utilizing for exploratory perspectives rather than the safety component. But for this case, we're going to discuss directly about the DEXA, the MRI, MRE, some of the uphill battles we had there, that didn't lead to any headaches or anything like that. But for this one, it was particularly around around phantom scans. So it's cross-calibration phantom scans. So we utilize those for studies when using imaging, particularly DEXA, as far as to as far as a calibration perspective across multiple DEXA facilities. So you'd have your independent, calibration scans that you would do daily on the same machine. That's what they would do normally for a DEXA machine. That is, to make sure that they either do them daily or prior to doing like a patient DEXA scan. That's going to be your IQCs, your instrumental quality control scans. But the phantom cross calibrations are done across multiple facilities to ensure kind of like a calibration, ensure consistency, for lack of a better word, across all these DEXA machines to make sure there's not variation, so that variation is going to affect what the results are going to be from patient to patient scans.
Got it. And I think you kind of described it, but just if you could maybe go into it. So a phantom cross calibration is what exactly? It's when, actually, maybe you could go into that.
Of course. With me not being a imaging technician, I will give you the best breakdown that I can. So like a phantom, it's, it could be like a cylinder or plates per se. And it's going to have a certain density or whatever to it. That's what the DEXA facility will scan and then provide those results, that will be provided on to the imaging vendor from there. And then when we say cross calibration, so you're going to do it across multiple of the DEXA facilities. So you have the phantoms, and then they will be passed, shipped from site to site or facility to facility, more or less, for them to do these cross-calibration scans. And in reference, to this study as it being a safety component, this was integrated into and needed to be done at each site once throughout the life of the study so that we can get that data from each DEXA facilities. That phantom, that cylinder, or those plates, whichever ones, kind of you're utilizing, and that'll show the consistencies that, they scan it should be a certain density, everything like that. And then those phantom or phantoms will then be shipped, from site to site for each one to do it. And then you'll, collect that data from each DEXA facility you're using to then compare. And then you can look at, patient data from there also, and then bring in within the DEXA phantom cross calibration, that data to make sure and see where the consistency goes. And if there's a certain, adjustment that's needed, for the data based upon what the results come back from that phantom scan, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think I get it. Hopefully our listeners do too. So calibration is definitely a common thing. I don't know if I'd heard the term phantom, but so you'd mentioned that the core challenge here was that you needed all the sites to do this.
Yep.
And you were getting to the end of the study, and it turned out that wasn't happening. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct. One of those things where it was on everyone's radar per se, that we knew that prior to our database lock, each site needed to do it. So we were a few months out from our database lock, and there's a certain number of factors and variables that were in play here. But start out with the issue at hand was coming into, we had realized that much further along as far as having all these sites, that have completed these phantom cross-calibration scans. And when it came about, we only had, I believe it was something, and we had 80 total sites for this study approximately, and we had maybe a little over a third of them had completed. So we had roughly 40 plus or so, trying to remember correctly, but it was around there that needed to have these cross calibrations. And to add kind of to that is that it's not like we had 40 phantoms available to just start, all right, let's say about each, we had to start out, I think it was maybe like 4 or 5 phantoms, So from there, it was kind of, right away, oh gosh, we have this amount of time, roughly a few months left. To be said, this was also during COVID. So, everything was kind of layering up, where beyond the fact that it's like, all right, well, what's the easiest kind of solution here? It's like, well, let's get more phantoms. Well, there's not, like a room storage full of phantoms that, was to be able to secure more phantoms. They only had a certain amount that were provided for us in our contract for the study. We had to go out, try to find facilities, all that. But, that was a part of what we can get further into, is trying to mitigate the situation and figure out, what we could do. It was a tough one when we kind of figured out where we stood and, that hill we had to climb from there. So
So this calibration, it could happen at like any time of the study as long as it was before the lock, or it didn't have to happen at the beginning?
Anytime. So in a perfect world, and as we always say, hindsight's 2020, in a perfect world, what we did start out from the beginning, we had, don't remember the exact number, but I know we had a few of them, maybe 3 or 4 phantoms to be passed around. And, we started out, but it was, in the beginning, with imaging, there's always, it kind of almost gets into a tiered space where you get sites that get activated or authorized. They do kind of like the initial procedures to make sure that the machine they have is, sufficient. So you do all the paperwork, as well as they do kind of like the intro scans to make sure that they can do scans according to the protocol and all that. So, and you kind of do them in a tiered status where, you get some up and running right away. And then as you with anything in startup, you're kind of scrambling to try to do other sites and get them activated, all across the board for many things. So like I said, hindsight 2020, in a perfect world, they get authorized, activated. You try to do it, those phantom scans right away, knock them off, check them off the list or whatever. But, other things pop up where then you start worrying about, all right, we have all these other, facilities when you get up and running. So then you're not focusing too much on that. There's always the kind of scramble as you kind of come across to make sure that you're getting everyone activated and you're doing that. But as far as those cross calibrations, but from there, yeah, I think, we did, get them sent out to some of these sites, but in the commotion of COVID and many other things, they started to sit at sites, especially those early ones. And then you kind of move on to the next thing, and then you're tracking and all that. But the tracking was kind of lacking in that aspect. And then we had, we did have some turnover as far as project managers. We had some great project managers on the vendor side, but we had some turnover. And with that, it's kind of sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, where you're kind of having to realign, with things and all that. But yeah, so we kind of started, that took a little bit of a back seat as we were getting through a few things. So.
Oh man, those are a lot of challenges. I think turnover pretty common for people. COVID, that's a shared lived experience there. You mentioned like a limited number of plates. Is that common in your experience to not have enough for these kinds of scenarios?
Yeah. So I guess that's a loaded question, because when you say like, is it enough? Is it enough? It's like, you come in and you try to secure enough phantoms that will be sufficient throughout the life of the trial. So I'd say it's always logistics. So, you come in, you say you have 80 sites, it's going to be, let's say a 2-year study. You're like, all right, we have enough time. We should have, say with 5 or 6 phantoms, to move from one site to the next. Depends how you're doing it. Are you doing it where you send them out, you hope that the sites turn it over real quickly, so they have the phantom, they're going to do the scans, they finish up, then they send it, whether it's going to be a site to site or facility to facility, if you can coordinate that, or do they need to send them back to the vendor, then the vendor needs to send them back. You always have like a little bit of that lead time in that. So, a lot of times I think you're always coming in and you take experience with anything, take your experience, will this be enough? And then we'll work from there. But it's the way it always goes, is that what you had planned, does it turn out where, you get one thing or another, and then, things get delayed. And it's not even from like a COVID perspective, but with these imaging facilities are very, very busy. Only a handful of them are, let's say, very putting time aside for research per se, very busy with patients. And then, on top of research, and with research, you have, some additional measures that you're not doing, let's say in the clinic setting. So, they have to do like the startup piece, and there's all these extra things, they're kind of involved. We'll start up, and then the normal daily calibrations are part, that's ingrained into theirs. So that's not anything different really, but, sending the data in a clinic setting, they don't need to send data to vendors, whether they're putting on CDs or sending that over through a portal electronically, however that's going to go. So it'll, I can only imagine from their aspect, it's kind of like, another research study, kind of additional steps, and all that. I think from that perspective, things can get delayed. It's like they're fitting in, research patients on top of their busy schedules, but then having them say, all right, you're going to have to do these phantom scans, for this cross calibration. That's another thing for them to add on. So you have to kind of understand in their predicament. Sometimes they're having to do them during their lunch hours or during after hours, because their, schedules are so busy. So that's why you can easily see where they can sit, those phantoms sit on site, or that facility for maybe a week, 2 weeks, maybe more, as they're like, yep, I'll do it tomorrow. That kind of thing. So.
I think that the topic of site burden is something that comes up like all the time, right?
Yeah.
I guess, looking back at this study, were there elements of, the site burden that you would either like change or just like think about for future studies that people should be aware of when it comes to things like phantom scan calibrations?
Yeah, and it's tough. I think, I think it goes all around is that where the site level, facility levels goes, as far as do they have sufficient staffing, sufficient time, everything takes time. So yeah, that's just, it is the burden, and we try to work with and, and provide the best support you can, whether that's whether on the CRO side, the sponsor side, whoever kind of is leading that oversight and all that. But I think, it's just tough. I think we see it all the time, especially, database locks, anything, not just even say it for like this facility with these scans, you're on top of the sites. Hey, enter this data, resolve these queries, do all that. But it's like, we're trying, but you're not our only study. And that's where something, it's easy to forget about, you have these dedicated research sites, but then you have these imaging facilities and how many studies are they doing on top of the patients? And we're hounding them. Hey, we didn't receive this. You didn't do that.
Right.
Yeah, we're trying our best, that burden. And you're trying to, thread the needle where it's like, all right, we have a timeline and you need to make this, but at the same time, we do need their cooperation. So how do you push them, but then not make them want to just be like, nope, I'm just not going to answer that email of that.
Oh man, I wish we had someone on the site right now just to answer that, because I could just imagine all of them go, yes. Yeah, I think, on the matter of oversight and such, it sounds like this was a little bit complex from a logistical perspective. So you did have a limited number of plates, and I wasn't sure if you said it was site to site or site back to vendor, but yeah, someone was in charge of this, right? Yeah. Like someone's responsibility was to kind of make sure that this like was happening throughout the study. So yeah, kind of what happened there with that person? Was it the turnover? Was it talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, no. And that's part of it, is that, and I know has been discussed a million times. You always look at, especially from the beginning, of a study, you're looking at oversight, it's like the racy, like who's responsible, accountable, and all that, who needs to be informed. And, you're looking at, who holds the contract for the vendor. Is it a sponsor or the CRO? Who has the oversight of how that's kind of mixed in and all that? And then how are we overseeing every aspect of this, And I think a lot of times, especially in an instance like this, we get so in tuned and worried about the patient scans. Are they in window? Are they the data itself? And that, there's a lot of these other items, with the normal calibrations. And for this instance, the phantom cross calibrations, that we needed. It's one of those things that out of sight, out of mind, but it's in mind and we're tracking it. But in this particular instance, there was the transparency, I guess, was what was part of the issues, that we had some manual trackers and listings that we're utilizing. They have their internal database that everything's going into. We had limited insight into like a portal per se. So like their portal that we can go in and confirm that scans were being done, what was the status, and, they had their own querying, the way that they queried sites, and they sent those out. So like, as far as querying, what I mean by that is saying, okay, we're missing this scan for the patient. You haven't sent in your your monthly calibrations that show, that you're doing your normal calibrations. And also you haven't had your one phantom cross calibration scan done. But this was all being tracked manually on their side, and we were getting, monthly or weekly updates of these trackers. And from there, forever, it was, the focus wasn't on those, cross calibrations. And, they did have, they said they were keeping up. It was moving along, but we didn't have like a granular at each site, which one was done and all that. And we were more focused on their monthly calibrations, make sure they're doing those, and then also the patient scans, especially as you moved along, you're kind of getting your timelines, making sure, all right, when's your last scan is going to be, making sure we're getting the data. And then it was maybe 6+ months before the database lock that the sponsor, they had an imaging expert who was kind of leading it. The CRO, we were responsible for the more or less the oversight of all aspects, but they had like the imaging expert that was kind of part of working like a liaison with the sites and the vendors, making sure things were going along. And she had brought up like, so are we on point for, these cross calibrations? And then we went back and they're like, yep, things are moving along. and we asked for a full layout, they were like, oh, by the way, this kind of did get, the ball got dropped. And, it was kind of, we're only here. So, yeah, so that was what kind of, and that's when then we were, it took, a few weeks to gather the information. All right, well, how bad is this? Where are we at? Where are these phantoms at? Because we had literally like one or two of the phantoms sitting at a site for like 6 months. So it was like, all right, do they still have it? It wasn't thrown away, was it? And it was one of those things. Yeah.
Oh man. So the central imaging vendor that was kind of in charge of doing these scans, they didn't have a portal for you. And so you were reliant on their project team to send you at the CRO a manual tracker of everything that had like happened in the last week or so.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Ooh, that's okay. That's rough. But I guess it sounds like 6 months, I think you said, into the study or before database lock?
Before database lock. So it was approximately relatively, let's say like 6 months. It was, if my mind,
time before database lock.
Correct. Yeah.
And someone goes like, where are we with this? Right. I guess did no one like ask that question when they were looking at the manual week, or was that just information not there? Or
I think it was a perfect storm. Like I said, it was, it was COVID. So we were going through and let me take a step back also, is because these cross calibrations have to be done at each site at least once. But if they change a machine, they have to get a new machine. You have to do another one, because it's like not just at each site, it's the machine itself. So, so you have to reauthorize, that site for that machine, and you go through this whole process. So there was, 2 steps forward, 1 step back with some of these. But as far as the oversight, it was tough, is because we're so focused on patient data and those kind of regular, normal, monthly calibration, data that we get from them. So, they, like I said, they do their normal machine calibrations, and then once a month they send those in to show us that they're doing it. And that's when I say like the monthly calibration. So you have a focus on those, because we were delayed on getting some of those sites, with some of the project manager turnover. And then, it was kind of like an oversight on our part, as far as not following up as closely on a site-by-site basis. It was more or less because everything was in a manual tracker. It was that, we were kind of a little bit of an assumption that, which is the worst part, I think, from the assuming, or, and this is exactly what we're talking about. This is from an oversight perspective, is that, not tracking at that granular level, like where are we at with each site? Which one is this? And I think a big part of that comes to the full understanding of these, cross calibrations that need to be done. It was a little bit that, we understood all these sites, the patient data, you're tracking all that, making sure, they're in window, we're getting them all done, we're getting the data sent in. And then you're having this thought process that these cross calibrations need to be done once. Yes, this is moving along. The sponsors on top, or the vendors on top of this, working with these sites, and then, not looking at the granular level.
Oh man, I probably should have asked this at the beginning, but what was the implication of not having done this? Like, had this, let's say you never noticed this, right? You get to the end of the study, kind of what was the impact of the study to the patients? You said it was a safety measure, so. What was the impact?
So we needed it to utilize the patient DEXA data. We needed it to be done at each site in order to do the comparison of that phantom scan against the data, for each site. So we couldn't move forward with the database lock and in order to use that DEXA data for those patients without having these scans done at each site. It had direct implications against our database lock and our timelines there, is because, the data, and especially we were contracted out and we were using, this DEXA data as far as a safety, perspective, this was ingrained into that. So we couldn't, move along with that data. So that put us at a spot where it was, all right, obviously there was no discussions to not use the DEXA data. So it was like, well, we need to get this done. Part of the worst case scenario would be, to delay the database lock, which is, I think, one of those things that there's always concerns, and there's always, up to the wire with vendor data, whether you're trying to get it clean, you're doing last minute vendor, data transfers to make sure that that data come in is clean and all that. But I think, from our perspective, this was one of the last things that we were expecting to be the possibility to delay our database lock and all that.
Well, I mean, thankfully you guys did it. So
Yeah.
congratulations to the team on this study. And it does sound like, thankfully in this case, the calibrations are something that could be done after the measurement, right? Which is also good because that data is still relevant at the end of the study and there was no safety implication. You just needed to do it. So it's kind of thankfully one of those, you got to get it done, but we can get it done kind of thing. So that's good. All right, so I guess starting some of the juicy questions, right? So let's just start brainstorming, right? How could this have been avoided? Like, what would you do differently, Kyle?
I get, hindsight's 2020 is because, again, I'd say that a million times, but I think it's just always what we say. But so from that, I think from the start, you would be like, all right, knowing what I know now, we could sit here and say, oh, I would track it at the granular level. I would look at each site we'd have. If it was, we would be looking, and whether you're doing weekly vendor calls or bi-weekly, whatever it is, that you're doing monthly calls with your vendor, you'd have like a ongoing agenda discussion, to go over where we're at, or maybe you just touch on if you're having any, roadblocks with those. But from that perspective, I mean, you'd have an easy listing of every site and see where we're at. A yes or a no. Is that facility, is that machine, had it done or not, and kind of go from there. So, I mean, I think, that's where we could start to say, how this could have been avoided, but I think it's also at what point I came in a little later internally the team. So that's one of those things where I think it's, we can go from all around, is that we can't put sole blame, say, on the vendor. It's their responsibility, and that. So I think, we, as far as from a CRO, a sponsor, from an oversight perspective, that's why we have our checks and balances type thing, is that we're all in this together, and everything else. But, it's like, I came in a little later as far as, on study and, this vendor component. We had some changes on, the vendor side. It's like, who knows at what spot where we left off and all that. But I think that's where from the start, you look at all these components, and that's where it's so important to understand every aspect of your vendors, what's in the blueprints from them, like what are you doing as far as with these vendors, who has the oversight, how are we tracking this oversight? So I think that's one of those things is that, is knowledge is power. And that's where, when you're coming from an oversight perspective, not to assume, like, okay, they said it's moving along, so we're good, is like, show me that on paper, or, the vendor has all the bells and whistles and can provide these reports or anything to the report, their portals or anything from their, database, or are we, doing things in a manual way? Well, let's, make sure that there's transparency. Everyone has this data and, and kind of, we have, multiple people kind of looking at this. I think sometimes when it gets into that one person's court is also where we get in trouble as well, is that you have the gatekeeper, the key holder, this person, oh yeah, I'm watching, everything's going well. Then someone comes in and is like, all right, let me take a look. And then it's like, oh, wow, wait, you said it was good. Well, I thought it was, and so it's like, I think we have this, collaboration, amongst, whether it's internal or, cross collaboration, not calibration, with other, kind of team members, whether that's across from the CRO or the sponsor, working together and all that.
Oh man, I feel like you're just hitting on all the things people experience all the time. You went over a couple of them. I want to dig into that a little bit. Okay,
Sure.
So the first one was, you said, you would come in later. Obviously super common, and there had been some turnover, right?
Yep.
So if we were to drill into the challenge of turnover, right? What are the kinds of questions you'd be asking yourself, or what advice would you give to people about coming into a situation where there's turnover, how to set yourself up for success, knowing that like there's probably like a whole bunch of stuff you don't know, right?
For sure. Yeah. So I think you need documentation, like in your vendor management plans, or, if you're looking at in that aspect, or even your study plans, in any way, like you need to document it. You can't just have it where it's, so-and-so is an expert in this area or has a lot of experience. We're going to leave it up to them, to kind of oversee it and all that, and I try to always align people's strengths with, task responsibilities. We do it all the time as far as indications with studies with all our team members. But as far as, but we still need documentation of how we're going about and doing all of our oversight perspective. If it's not there, when you have that turnover, how's anybody going to know, and especially if you have a bit of turnover from person to person, it's like, well, who's left from the start of the study, and it's like, so if you're, we can't pass it along word of mouth, we need all that documented clearly of how we're going to go about and do all these checks and balances oversight, for in this instance, I have to look back I can't look back, but I'm trying to remember if we had our vendor management plan and all that, it clearly documented how we're going about, doing the cross calibrations, how this will be tracked and all that. But I think that, that's going to be your core of how, you need to track it and make sure that that's available for training and, and everything to all team members. And so that they can reference it as well and look back and having those kind of detailed out.
Okay, so there's like this element of, turnover is going to happen. So make sure the what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it is documented somewhere so that when person A leaves, person B isn't just like, what? I have no idea what's going on. Okay. That makes sense. Okay, the second thing you had mentioned is this one-person gatekeeper. It sounds like documentation might also be the recommendation here, but is there anything you'd like to add about like how single person can be like a bottleneck or failure and what you do about that?
Yeah, and that's always a tough one is because you say like a one-person gatekeeper is that on vendor side, again, we touched on this a little bit, is how does their systems work? What's the transparency in there? In a perfect world, we have, the vendor, they have a very robust portal that has a great, reporting system. It's easy for us in a moment's notice. It's in real time to pull this stuff, understand where it's at. But, in this instance, some of theirs had an element that they had this all internal, but it wasn't maybe client or facing to us from what they can provide. So it was in a mix between pivot tables and all of that. They would export the data and provide it over to us, but it would be like in a manual tracker type thing. Right. So more or less, it's the data from their system. It's not like someone has to go in there in each cell in an Excel and put in the data. Was exporting the data, but putting it in a way then to provide it over to us. And, we got these updated trackers like on a weekly basis and all that. It kind of gets to the point where it is that one person gatekeeper where that's going to be, that's on the vendor side that, project managers. Sometimes, I guess more or less, that's hard to get around when it depends what are the outputs, from their systems and what they can provide to us. If it's not, and that real time fancy portal kind of type thing, and then, but from our side is making sure we understand that as well. And what are the risks there? So I think that that's something that, you kind of come into and you see, all right, you identify these risks. All right, it's kind of does bottlenecks, to one person to having these and we need to provide them to them, maybe one project manager was better about keeping these updated than the other one, pulling this data more regularly, keeping oversight of it, what they're providing to us. So is that kind of full knowledge of where does this data, all this information data lie? How are we getting it? Is it in real time? How does it go about there? And then making sure, to kind of look at that from a risk perspective and seeing, what those can. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, real time is definitely extremely important. I think having that, you need data. Like you need data about the operations of your study. You need obviously your clinical data, but I think it is critical to actually know what's happening contemporaneously. Absolutely agree. That's not always an option. Yep. So I guess a couple of questions here. First off, is how should someone, let's say that they're at the beginning of the study and they're assessing their vendors now and they have to make these trade-offs, whether or not they're costs or maybe it's because their specific study doesn't have a vendor who has a portal. Like how should one think about these kinds of trade-offs when going into a study? And I guess maybe the real kicker is if you were in a position to make some of these choices in the future, like would you push for it and under what circumstances?
Going about it again, is, and again, I think we all try to get away from manual tracking. For this instance, we didn't have, for that real-time data, but, we were getting it weekly and it was the easiest mitigation here was from the beginning, we should have been pushing along and finding those, kind of bottlenecks and roadblocks. And if we didn't have, a robust enough or sufficient, what we thought, kind of tracking system, what it was at, then if we need to go out about making our own, then that's what you need to do. I think, what I was saying was we try to get away from manual tracking, but I think it's always inevitable that we end up doing it. I think we've come long ways with outputs and analytics and things that we can pull from many different databases and look at things in real time. But I think there's always, a manual tracking perspective. So if that was, trying to fill in the gaps, so not promoting manual tracking per se, but when it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And in this instance, if we were having, to build upon what we had from the data we were receiving from them, follow up internally from our perspective with these sites, we were kind of being notified. So I guess this is a good component of it, is that we were only being notified if we weren't provided, these, as far as in real time, like, oh, we're having all these issues with these sites. We were being escalated when they had a phantom laying at a site for an extended period of time. Like, hey, we can't get hold of them. They're not completing it. Now we need to follow up. So when we had those escalation queries, to us, then we would kind of step in. But, from our internal tracking and kind of cutting off that, why do we need to be following up when it becomes an escalation? So kind of following through, making sure they're passing along. Sites are notified before, the vendor would reach out and ask them, confirm the address when they're shipping these phantoms to each facility, confirm address, make sure, hey, timelines, we want to make sure that you guys will be able to do it in this amount of time, or, make sure that we can turn it over, to pass along to the next site, the kind of those an understanding from the site. But for them, it's easy to just be like, yep, this is our address, send it out, we'll get it done right away. And then, life happens and then it gets pushed off. So is that, to kind of have that cross collaboration between the vendor and say, whether it's the, CRO or sponsor that's, responsible for the oversight perspective, is to then in parallel reach out and say, hey, yep, I know you guys received this, make sure we're moving along. How's it coming along? Do you have a set time, or maybe even filling in that void, because most of the time vendors, they'll have a process, and what they're contracted to, it's like a notification, and they provide, a template of sorts of information, and this is what's going to happen. But you can have that, that personable kind of relationship. And what we have, whether it's from a CRO or sponsor, working with sites, like, hey, I know you're receiving it. I know you're super busy, providing that little, kind of smooth things over as well. Like, I know you're super busy, but if you could really do this for me, instead of the stale, like, all right, I received the 5th email from the vendor and it says I haven't done it yet. I understand it. I'm so kind of add in that, is there anything we can do to support you? So kind of have in parallel that kind of thing to make sure these things are moving along. It doesn't have to be over complex, right. But I think it's great. I think a lot of us have these complaints with anything, is that, oh, it's amazing I got someone on the phone these days. You call customer service, oh, it's always going to recording, or, it's something like that. So you get someone, you're talking to, hey, everything's going well, this and that. I think that's a good component too. So I think, having that, let's not just send a bunch of emails, let's get on the phone, talk to them, make sure things are moving along. We don't have to wait till it's an issue, to make sure that we're following up. Kind of
we
thing.
don't have to wait. Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like there's this element of you're constantly firefighting, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of little smoldering patches here or there, right? Yeah. And the challenge is not, how do you stop firefighting? Because, I mean, you're going to firefight the whole time. Yep. But it's how do you do, like, the little things, like the check-ins, if something's quiet, just make a phone call, what's going on? It's like, how do you manage the relationship so that these smolders just don't turn into the fires? And, thankfully... Yeah, I mean, and that's probably, I would say that's probably the crux of oversight, which is how do you kind of maintain an eye on those smolders and do the little things so that they never become, the fires, so to speak. Yeah. We talked a lot about, hindsight being 2020. I think that's always the case, but it also sounds like your team did a really great job at making sure that this actually ended up not being such a big deal. So let's talk about, like, what did your team do super well, 6 months before lock? You found out, oh, crap, we didn't do these cross calibrations. And how did you guys lead the team? How was this done? What was the collaboration like? And what advice do you have for other people when you're in a situation like this?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, it was what many study teams do, and this is across the board is, pivot to what, pivot your resources and everything, to kind of get it done. So I think that like before I talked about how it was like 6 months when we started kind of like looking into like, hey, kind of where are we at with this? It was, relatively, it might've been a little less than 6 months, but it took a little bit to kind of get a true understanding of the scope of where we're at with this, like how far are we behind and all that. And once we did, we were only a few months out, like I said, having roughly half or more of the sites to do this. I think it was, maybe like a approximate 2 year study. So, I mean, you had all that time and you're looking at, gosh, you had all the time to do this. But, and I think it's what we do on a daily basis in research is kind of like talking about those fires, put out the fire. It's like all the resources, not all is because, we still had, a milestone, that goal, coming up. So we couldn't just, couldn't take everyone in the ClinOps, kind of area and be like, hey, we need everyone to focus over here. But, is to kind of add resources, make sure that we're, getting on the ball, touching base with these sites. And, one of the first things we did was, kind of get the full understanding of where we're at, and then try, to get a game plan, kind of see where we're at, and what is the best option for this. And for us at that time, the best was we needed to secure some more phantoms, to pass along to sites, so that was, kind of one of the first things was. And being in COVID at that time, the vendor was like, we don't have any more to secure. So we had to start looking around and, looking at, we went to our, internally with some of our vendor and supply managers and management and to see, hey, what kind of companies or where, do you know that we can maybe go to, see if we can secure additional ones, kind of try to think outside the box what we can do and kind of go there. So that was kind of one of the start was to utilize all your resources. So not just look at, our internal study team, but, from us at, the CRO was looking at, some of our team members who are kind of in supply management, vendor management, and kind of see, hey, where can we go? What are the other resources? Work with the vendor themselves. Hey, what vendors, do you utilize to secure, these phantoms and all that? That was kind of the initial step and kind of see what we could secure and go from there. This was a global study, but luckily it was only in the US that we had this issue too. So it's because, if you look at it from a global, standpoint, which again, we were very fortunate too, but, I had recently worked on a study that had an imaging component with DEXA, and we had this pop up. Thankfully, it turned out that we did not need to have these cross calibrations done. It's not something in the data that we were going to do, but there was a time where we had talked about it, and they were like, and it was a change in vendor managers, like, oh, by the way, they sent out an email to a site to let them know about this coming through. And then we started asking about it. And they're like, it brought up that, like, wow, this has to be done. And then I started getting like deja vu, nightmares. Like, no, not again. This did not happen again. I didn't, kind of, this is not, didn't go under the radar. But it was like, oh, it was an error on the vendor part where they sent it out to have this done at a site, but it actually didn't need to be done.
Yeah.
But it just made me think about, and this was like a component that, kind of brought this up, was like, we were very lucky that it was isolated to the US and not on a global stage, especially with multiple countries. If you look, the time it takes to ship around a handful of these phantoms to different sites, get it done. Can you imagine this on a global stage with a limited number of these phantoms? Yeah. And then you're talking customs. Yeah, it's just going to get right through from country to country. There's always that component of, vendor, and a global study is getting things in and out of countries and, securing all that stuff. So again, coming back to this one, it was good that it wasn't on the global stage. It was secure, it was isolated to just the US. So we had to come up with that game plan and kind of look at, overarching from all sites is that which are sites, and then also included in that is start to, plan out what is the site to site that we're going to go to. We're not just going to go down the line of, site 1 is the first one, site 2 is the second one, site 3. So you have to look at it. One of the things we did very well was to look at it from a performance perspective. So which facilities are truly compliant with getting data out, submitted right after scans are done, no issues with, quality of data, how quick they are to response, the responsiveness. We had to look at that to each site. So if you just start going down the line and then you get 2 or 3 sites that are not as compliant or responsive in a row, you might have some of these phantoms just sitting at these sites, for an extended period. So, all right, let's kind of offset it. Let's say, this site's great. Let's send it out to them. This site's not great. We can send it out to them. Send out to another great site. So kind of offset it, tier it in that way. So that you're going to maybe see some holdups at these, but you're not going to see multiple at once. So you at least have a few of these phantoms who are readily moving site like that. Yeah.
All right. So for those who get into a position like this, it sounds like the advice is, take a breath, take a step back, gather the data, take a pause, get your multiple perspectives on that. So like which sites are better performing, how can we really attack this problem? And then, I guess with the getting the more phantoms, reach out for help, right? So go to the other people in your network, go to the other study teams, ask them what they've done, who they've worked with, how can they be of help? And finally, I guess just execute with the limited time you have.
For sure. And I think that there's a few great points, you're hitting on there. It's as far as, the reaching out for help. I think that that's always so vital is because, and I think this goes down in a very small level or to a very, large level is that I think, especially when issues come about, always trying to resolve or fix or mitigate, but use our resources and reach out for help, and especially there's a lot of people who've been in similar situations, so it's like, hey, what has worked? Not sit there and brainstorm in a group that's like, we've never come across this. What's going to happen? Let's try this. It's like, let's try to get, reach out to all your resources, figure out, hey, have you come across this? What has worked? What hasn't? Because that could shave off quite a bit of time and effort, as far as, not recreating the wheel here is like, hey, come across this. This is what we did, for this. No one that we were working with had come across it, so it was, a big brainstorm, but amongst all, but, and trying to figure out who can help, how can we help, and, kind of getting that, kind of rolling there. So.
Well, hopefully someone listening here is seeing their own study in this conversation and going, oh, that's really helpful. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for being here. How can folks reach out to you if they ever want to learn more about what you've spoken about, or how can the listeners be useful to you?
Oh, man. Yeah. I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's probably the best way to touch base, with me. But other than that, I think the moral of this story and most is just knowledge is power, understanding exactly where you're at, I think it was a good point, when you come into these situations, take a deep breath, utilize your resources, figure out. But as far as, if you have questions or, anything else, I always love talking about, things that, issues that you've run into, ways to mitigate. I think mitigation is the number one key as far as, looking at items and identify risks before they become issues and kind of, how to approach them if that kind of come about. So I always love brainstorming, learning new experiences and kind of, figuring out ways it could, help me out, or I'd love to help anybody else out in the future for sure.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Kyle, for being here. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Trial and Error. Remember, every step forward in clinical research brings us closer to the next medical breakthrough. Our goal is to spread knowledge and improve the chance that life-saving drugs make it to market. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider rating us or giving us a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast. Most importantly, though, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out directly and say hello.